They didn't knock. They didn't even try. The door flew open at 11:45 at night. Her husband came in first. His mother came in right behind him. And the other woman, she stood back near the doorway, holding a set of spare keys in her hand, as she'd already moved in mentally months ago. Nadine didn't run. She didn't scream. She stood up from the couch slowly, the way someone stands when they've already accepted that something painful is about to happen, and they've decided to face it on their feet. His mother grabbed one arm.
Get out!
He grabbed
Don't you
the
ever
other,
come back
and
here!
they dragged
You
her
heard him! Leave
across
now!
the living room floor
And
of the
stay
house
away!
she had cleaned, decorated, and maintained for 11 years. Dragged her like she was something broken that needed to be thrown out. And they pushed her out onto the front steps in November air, so cold it felt like a slap. The door slammed. Inside, she could hear them talking, moving things around, laughing at something. Outside, Nadine sat on those steps in the dark, and her phone started buzzing in her pocket. She looked at the screen. She didn't answer, because she already knew something that none of them in that house had figured out yet. And what they didn't know was about to change everything. Hold on, before we go any further into this story, if you are new here, hit that subscribe button right now, because we tell stories like this every single week. Real stories about betrayal, survival, and the kind of justice that doesn't make noise until it's already done. Also, drop a comment right now and tell me, where are you watching from today? I want to know who's in this with me. Now let's get into it. To understand what Nadine did, you have to first understand what they put her through. And to understand that, you have to go back to the day they buried her father. The repast was held at Greater Bethel's Fellowship Hall on Ardmore Avenue. If you know black funerals, you know that hall. You know the smell, somebody's macaroni and cheese in foil trays, sweet tea already sweating on the table, flowers that cost too much sitting next to paper programs that somebody stayed up too late printing. You know the way the older women move through the room with purpose, filling plates for people who forgot to eat, pressing hands, nodding, holding space. Nadine Elise Worthy had organized every detail of that repast herself. She had called the caterer. She had coordinated the flowers. She had typed the funeral program and sat at her kitchen table past 2 in the morning, getting the wording right because she needed every sentence to honor who her father actually was. Not a polished version of him, but him. The real man. That was who Nadine was. She was the woman who handled things. Completely. Quietly, without asking for a trophy. She was 42 years old, not flashy, not the kind of woman who walked into rooms demanding attention. But if you watched her long enough, really watched her, you'd notice something. She always seemed to be operating from a place just a few steps ahead of everyone else. Not arrogant about it, not performing it, juste hawar. The way people are aware when they've been paying careful attention for a very long time. Her husband Devon was present the way a ghost is present. Physically in the room, not actually there. He'd worn the right suit. He'd shaken hands with the right uncles. He'd nodded somberly at the right moments. But Nadine had felt his distance like a draft coming through a wall. You can feel the cold, you just can't find the crack. He kept stepping outside to take calls. He kept tilting his phone screen away every time she got close enough to see it. She noticed. She always noticed. She just didn't say anything yet. Choosing her moment was something she'd learned from her father. Now, Devon's mother, Vernetta, was a woman who had turned condescension into an art form. She moved through that fellowship hall like she was doing the room a favor. Lips pressed into something that wasn't quite a smile. Eyes that appraised every person in every corner and found almost everything lacking. Vernetta had never accepted Nadine. That's the polite way to say it. The real way to say it is that Vernetta had decided 11 years ago that her son had married beneath himself, and she had been quietly building a case for that position ever since. Every Christmas dinner. Every family cookout. Every phone call where she'd whisper into Devon's ear that Nadine was too independent, too focused on work, too cold, not the nurturing kind, not the kind of woman a man like Devon needed beside him. She had been polishing that narrative for over a decade, and Devon, whether he realized it or not, had been absorbing it. Nadine knew. She let her build it. Because patient people can afford to let others talk. And then there was Simone. Simone had been introduced as a professional contact of Devon's, someone from his industry. She had no business being at the repast of a man she'd never met. But Devon had brought her with no explanation, and the family had accepted her presence the way you accept something that feels wrong when you're too deep in grief to challenge it by not looking at it directly. Simone was put together, composed. She held herself the way someone holds themselves when they believe they've already won something. And when Devon came back from one of his outside phone calls, Simone reached over and touched his arm. Just once, briefly. The kind of touch that says, I know you, in a room full of people who don't know that she knows him like that. Nadine saw it from across the room. She set her cup of water down on the nearest table very carefully so that her hands wouldn't be holding anything. Then Devon pulled her aside. Not far enough. They were standing near the back hallway, and two of Nadine's cousins were at a table less than 10 feet away. And Devon spoke in this low, rehearsed tone, the voice of a man who had practiced this, who had picked this specific moment on purpose. Maybe because he thought her grief would make her softer. Maybe because he thought she'd be too broken to fight back. Or maybe, and this is the cruelest option, he just didn't think about her at all. He said he wanted a divorce. He said he'd been unhappy for years. He said he'd already retained a lawyer. He said all of it in that flat, distant tone, like he was reciting something someone else had written. Like the words were a script and not a knife. Like he was just delivering information rather than detonating something in the middle of her father's funeral repast. Nadine looked at him, not with tears, not with rage. She looked at him the way you look at a calculation you already finished. One of her cousins had gone completely quiet at that nearby table. She could feel the whole room doing that subtle shift, that particular social electricity when people realize they're witnessing something they weren't supposed to see but cannot look away from. And then she felt Vernetta's eyes from across the hall. Not shocked, not embarrassed, satisfied. That's when it hit her. Vernetta had known this was coming. This had been planned. They had chosen her father's repast, the day they lowered Ernest Worthy into the ground to do this. Something moved through Nadine's chest that was so much worse than anger. It was the specific devastation of realizing that people you called family had looked at your grief and seen a window of opportunity. That they had calculated that your pain would make you weak enough to just accept it. Her hands wanted to shake. She made them stop. She looked at Devon one last time and said quietly and evenly, "You should have waited until Wednesday." That was all she said. Devon blinked. She could see him running the words back, looking for the wound in them, finding something he assumed was just sadness. He figured she meant emotionally, that she needed more time after the burial before absorbing news like this. He filed it as a soft response and moved on. He had no idea what Wednesday meant. He had no idea what had already been signed. Nadine walked outside and stood in the church parking lot under a cold November sky, and she breathed. From the outside, she looked like a woman utterly destroyed, freshly widowed by grief, freshly cut open by her husband standing alone in a parking lot on the worst day of her life. Let it look that way. She drove home alone that night. The house already felt like somewhere she was leaving. Now, stop. Before we go any further, you need to understand who this woman was before any of this happened. Not who they said she was, who she actually was. Because the story Devon and Vernetta had been building and spreading for years was that Nadine was cold, detached, too wrapped up in her career to be a real wife, too independent to be a real partner. And that story is a lie that erases everything she ever gave. Her father, Ernest Worthy, worked in property management and commercial real estate on the South Side for over 30 years. Not the man at the top, the man who understood the ground. He read contracts and property assessments and zoning documents the way other men read box scores. He had a gift for seeing what a block could become before anyone else was willing to believe it. He raised Nadine alone after her mother passed when Nadine was 8. He raised her with discipline and early mornings and the kind of intentional preparation that black fathers give daughters when they understand the world is not going to be fair to her, so she needs to be built better than the world expects. He used to spread contracts out on the kitchen table after dinner, not as homework, as a conversation. He'd walk her through the language, the structure, the fine print, the way other fathers talk through game film or song chords. And he used to say to her, "Nadine, the person who understands the paperwork will always outlast the person who just makes the noise." She heard that so many times that it stopped being advice. It became the architecture of how she thought. She grew up understanding that silence is not the same as weakness, that patience is not the same as passivity, that the most powerful position you can hold is the one nobody knows you're in. She had loved Devon. That needs to be said without rushing past it. There was a time, maybe 7 or 8 years into the marriage, where the thing between them was real and warm and good. He used to call her his backbone, meant it as the highest compliment he had. She knew when he was having a bad day before he walked through the door, and she'd have food on the stove and music going low, and she'd just sit beside him without requiring anything from him while he found his way back. When Devon's first business failed, Nadine quietly restructured their household finances, picked up extra consulting contracts, and never once made him feel small about it. When the second venture collapsed 2 years later, she did the same thing. No speech, no scorekeeping. She just handled it because she believed in him and because real love shows up, especially when showing up costs you something. But somewhere in those years, the temperature dropped. It wasn't one moment. It was a slow bleed. It was Vernetta's voice getting louder in Devon's ear and reshaping how he saw his wife, turning Nadine's strength into something threatening instead of something to be grateful for. It was Devon's ego, bruised badly by those 2 failures, finding it easier to resent his wife's competence than to be challenged by it. Easier to believe his mother's story about Nadine than to examine his own role in why the warmth was leaving. And during all of those years, while he was drifting, while Vernetta was whispering, while the marriage was slowly going cold, Nadine had been building something. Not in secret, not out of spite. She had built it because building was what she knew how to do, and because some part of her, the honest part, the part her father had trained, understood long before she was ready to say it out loud that she needed something that was entirely hers. Something solid, something with only her name on it. If you are still watching, I need you to drop a like on this video right now because we are just getting to the part where everything flips. And if you know someone who has ever been counted out by the people closest to them, share this with them. They need to see where this goes. And make sure you hit that subscribe button. 4 days after the funeral they came. 11:45 at night. Nadine heard the car first, then voices. Devon's low and directing, Vernetta's sharp and efficient, and a third voice, Simone, that she recognized immediately. She stood up from the couch. She had maybe 90 seconds before the knock came. They didn't knock. Devon's face was set hard, jaw tight, eyes refusing to fully meet hers. Vernetta walked past Nadine into the hallway like the title had already transferred in her mind, moving through the space as if she owned it, touching counters and door frames as she passed them. And Simone hung back near the entrance. Not gloating, just watching, present. And then Nadine saw the boxes. They had brought boxes, pre-packed, already labeled. That detail landed like a fist to the chest, because those boxes meant this had been planned before he told her. Maybe weeks before. The conversation at her father's repast hadn't been Devon finally building up the nerve to tell his wife the truth. It had been step 1 of a plan that was already in motion before her father was even in the ground. Vernetta directed the whole operation without speaking a single word to Nadine directly. Just moved around her like she was furniture waiting to be removed. Telling Devon what went where. Deciding what stayed. Nadine gathered what she needed. Her father's old leather document folder. Her personal files. A few changes of clothes. She moved through that house slowly, without rushing, and she didn't cry. Not there. Not in front of them. Devon watched her. And something passed across his face that he couldn't control, something between confusion and unease. She was too calm. He had expected something. Tears. Outrage. Some kind of visible collapse that would confirm for him that he held the power in this room. He got none of that. What he got was a woman moving through her own home with the composure of someone who had already made peace with where she was going and who knew something about where she was headed that he couldn't read. His mouth opened once, like he was about to say something. He closed it. He couldn't find the words. And the fact that he couldn't find them unsettled him more than any argument would have. Simone stood near the doorway and watched Nadine move through that room. And she felt something she hadn't expected, a slow, creeping discomfort. Because the woman she was watching did not match the woman Devon had described to her. He had painted a portrait of a wife who had emotionally checked out years ago. A woman so buried in work she'd become a stranger in her own home. Cold, absent, gone. But what Simone was watching was a woman absorbing something enormous and choosing, deliberately, consciously, not to perform her pain for an audience. That distinction unsettled Simone in a way she couldn't fully name yet. She filed it away. The apartment Nadine moved into was small. One bedroom, thin walls, a radiator that knocked at night. Temporary, that was the word she kept using in her own mind. Just temporary. Her childhood friend Brianna showed up with 2 bags of groceries that first evening and sat on the floor with her because there wasn't enough furniture yet, and neither of them said anything about that. Brianna was the kind of woman who showed up without being asked and stayed without needing praise for it. In those first raw days, having her in that small space kept the walls from feeling like they were closing. Meanwhile, Vernetta was working with the family. She moved through the community the way a skilled person works a room, methodically, leaving no table unvisited. By the time Nadine's cousins were calling to check on her, several of them had already received Vernetta's version of events. Nadine had always been difficult, too focused on herself. Devon had given that woman 11 years and gotten coldness in return. It was sad, truly, but some people just weren't built for marriage. She delivered it with just enough reluctance to seem like she hated sharing it, which made people trust it more. The story calcified before Nadine could offer any counter-narrative. That was the whole point. Then came the birthday party. Devon's nephew, a 7-year-old named Jalen, had invited Nadine himself weeks before everything fell apart because she always brought the gift he actually wanted, and she'd get on the floor and play with him like she had nowhere better to be. She had promised him she'd come. She kept her promises to the children. She showed up, stood at the door, asked for Jalen, crouched down and handed him his gift and told him happy birthday and that she loved him. Vernetta materialized in the hallway behind the boy. And in front of everyone at that dinner table, with people mid-bite and mid-conversation and nowhere to hide from the words, Vernetta said, with that soft, poisonous pleasantness she had mastered over 60 years, that it was quite bold of Nadine to show up at a family gathering she no longer had any place in. That was it. Just that. Delivered with a little smile. Pleasant as a Sunday morning. The table went quiet. Nadine stood up slowly. Everything in her wanted to answer. Wanted to turn to that table and tell every single person there what had actually happened. At whose repast Devon had announced the divorce. Whose home she had been dragged out of at midnight. Who had stood in her hallway while another woman was handed her house key. All of it rose in her throat like a tide. She looked at Jalen instead, told him she'd see him real soon, and she walked back to her car. She sat in that parking lot for a long time. That night, alone in the temporary apartment with her father's leather folder in her lap, Nadine finally came apart. Not loud. That wasn't how she broke. She broke the way deep foundations crack, from the inside, slowly, with no performance for anyone because there was no one there to perform for. She sat on the floor and cried in that silent, heaving way that means the grief has been building longer than just this moment. She cried for her father. She cried for the marriage that had been dying for longer than she'd admitted to herself. She cried for the little girl at that kitchen table, learning to read contracts, believing that doing everything right would eventually be seen. She cried because she was a human being who had loved somebody completely and been publicly humiliated for it. And she was sitting on the floor of a one-bedroom apartment at 42 years old, and this was not supposed to be what her life looked like. She held the folder in her lap all night. She didn't open it. Not yet. Don't you dare click away. Because what I'm about to tell you next, what was actually inside that folder, and what Nadine had already been building while all of this was happening to her, is the part of this story that will hit you somewhere deep. Stay right here, and don't forget to subscribe, like, and share this video. Not let's get back, Brianna called the next morning. She'd heard about the birthday party from somebody who'd been at the table. She was furious in the way that real friends get furious, completely on your behalf, not asking you to manage their anger, just holding it for you. But then, after a few minutes, she said something from a place of genuine love and genuine worry. She said maybe Nadine should think about settling. Take what's fair, take what's clean, and start fresh somewhere she could breathe. She said, I just don't want to watch you spend 2 years fighting this thing and lose yourself in it. Those words landed hard, because they came from love, and because the tired part of Nadine, the part that had been carrying everything for so long, heard them and felt the pull of just letting it go, taking the small door, walking out small and just being done with it. There was a silence on that call long enough for Brianna to ask if she was still there. Nadine said yes. Said she'd think about it. A day and a half passed. Then she opened the folder. Ernest Worthy had owned a commercial property on the east side of Garfield Park. 20 years ago, that block was written off. People drove past it and saw a problem. An old building in a neighborhood they'd already given up on. Developers called it dead land. Community members had stopped expecting anything from it. Ernest bought it for almost nothing in the early 2000s. Held it through every economic downturn, held it when people called him foolish, held it when nothing moved and nothing changed, and the only thing that Parcel had going for it was that he believed in IT, and he was patient enough to wait. He had told Nadine about it years ago, at that same kitchen table, in that same quiet, serious voice he used when something mattered. He told her it was hers when he was gone, told her to hold it and be ready. At the time he told her, she was already in the middle of something. For the past 4 years, quietly and methodically, Nadine had been building a holding company, structured in her name alone, advised by a small team of attorneys and a financial consultant who had worked with her father for 20 years and trusted her without question. She had been acquiring small commercial properties, studying development corridors, cultivating relationships with a regional investment group called Keystone Legacy Partners that was looking for exactly the kind of strategic real estate portfolio she had been assembling. She did it slowly. She did it correctly. She did it without hiding it, everything documented, every transaction above board. She simply did it without announcing it, because Ernest Worthy had raised her to let the paperwork do the talking. Her father's property on that Garfield Park block was the final piece, the anchor, the cornerstone of a multi-corridor development deal that her team had been building toward for 4 full years. The total projected value of the completed deal with Keystone Legacy Partners, $40 million. She had signed the closing documents the afternoon of her father's repast. She had sat in her attorney's office 3 hours before the guests arrived and signed the most significant transaction of her professional life. Then she drove to Greater Bethel's Fellowship Hall, set out the food, greeted the cousins, accepted the condolences, watched Devon disappear to take phone calls, felt Vernetta's assessment from across the room, stood in that back hallway, and heard her husband tell her their marriage was over. And she had looked at him and said, "You should have waited until Wednesday." Wednesday was when the press announcement had been originally scheduled. He had humiliated her the evening before the world was going to find out who she was. He had thrown her out of the house 12 hours before the paperwork revealed she was about to own something neither of them could have imagined. The announcement event was moved to the following Friday when a downtown venue opened up sooner than expected. Nadine's attorney notified all relevant parties, including Devon's legal team, which was in the middle of asset division conversations and had been told to expect a corporate disclosure. Devon's lawyer told him. Devon told his lawyer it was a tactic, a bluff. He knew his wife. He knew what she had and what she was worth. He was certain. He was not certain. He just didn't know that he wasn't. The event was held at a conference center on Michigan Avenue. The room was filled with developers, urban planning professionals, community investment groups, and city officials. People who understood immediately, the moment the deal was described, exactly what kind of scale they were talking about. Devon had received an invitation through his contractor network. Keystone had engaged his small construction firm on a minor sub-project about 16 months prior, a routine job that his team had completed without him ever knowing or asking who was at the top of the organizational structure that had commissioned it. He'd assumed this event was about that project, a milestone for the larger development, a moment to be seen in a room of important people. He brought Simone. Because he thought this was his moment, and he wanted someone beside him for it. He was relaxed when he sat down. He was not relaxed for long. Nadine entered from a side door. Not the main entrance. No dramatic pause. No performance. She just came through the side, walked directly to the presenting table, and sat down. Dark blazer. Hair back. The expression of someone who was exactly where they had been headed for 4 years. Nobody in that room knew her face. But when the moderator stepped to the podium and began reading the introduction, when he said her full name into that microphone in front of 300 people, Devon felt the ground slide out from under his chair. The moderator laid out the deal. The corridors, the anchor parcel in Garfield Park, the 4 years of strategic assembly, the $40 million projected value. And then he explained that the lead architect of this project, the majority stakeholder, the silent partner who had structured everything from the foundation up, had never sought public recognition until this moment, had done this entire thing without fanfare, without press, without noise. Nadine's name went up on the screen behind the podium. Devon sat very still. Simone turned to look at him, and what she saw in his face was something she would not forget. Not anger, not embarrassment, but the raw, exposed expression of a man who realizes in one blinding moment that his map has been completely wrong, that the story he'd been telling himself, the story his mother had helped him build, had not been describing the woman who actually existed. Not even close. She thought about how she had characterized Nadine to herself. Absent, checked out, emotionally vacated. A woman who had abandoned her marriage for a career, and what she was looking at on that stage was a woman who had been more present, more focused, more purposeful than anyone around her had understood. The presence had just been aimed at something none of them had known to look for. Simone picked up her bag quietly and walked toward the exit. Devon didn't watch her go. He was still staring at the screen. Nadine took questions from the press with the steady, unhurried authority of someone who had been preparing for this specific room for years. She spoke about what the development would mean for the communities in those corridors. She spoke about her father, Ernest Worthy, who had held a piece of land in a neighborhood everyone had given up on because he believed that value doesn't announce itself. It arrives eventually for the people willing to wait. She said his name once into the microphone. Her voice did not waver. The room felt it. She never said Devon's name, not once. Never looked in his direction. The press conference was not about him. It had never been about him. And that invisibility, that complete absence of acknowledgement was more powerful than anything she could have said directly to him. The most devastating thing you can do to a person who wants to diminish you is not to need to mention them at all. Devon sat in that room until almost everyone else had left. He sat in the specific stillness of a man running a very long and very painful count. 11 years. She had been beside him for 11 years. She had held their finances together when his first venture went under. She had done it again when the second one collapsed. She had sat beside him in his worst moments without asking for anything in return. And the whole time, right alongside the dinner table and the arguments and the slow freeze of their marriage, she had been building something. Quietly, correctly, with the kind of patience that only comes from being raised right, and he had never seen it. He had looked at her every day and seen exactly what his mother told him to see. Had let his ego and his failures and Vernetta's voice reshape the woman in front of him into something easier to leave. He had chosen the day of her father's funeral to tell her he was done. He had had her dragged out of her own house at midnight. He had done all of it based on a story that was wrong from the very first page. That was irreversible now. It was public. It was permanent. He drove home alone. In the weeks that followed, things unraveled the way they unravel when the foundation was never honest, not in one explosion, but in the slow accumulation of consequences. Keystone's new partnership structure didn't include Devon's contracting firm. No one said it was retaliation. His company simply didn't fit the forward profile. But his network, which he had never realized, overlapped significantly with Nadine's professional world, and she began to see him differently. Not with contempt, with a quiet reassessment that was, in some ways, harder to absorb than contempt. Calls took longer to be returned. Invitations thinned. The texture of his professional life changed in ways he couldn't point to, but could feel building. Vernetta's world shifted too. One of Nadine's cousins had been at that repast, had been sitting at that nearby table when Devon pulled Nadine aside in the hallway, had heard every word, had known what day it was and whose grief was in that room when he chose to say those things. That cousin knew someone in the church community that Vernetta had built her entire social identity around. And the truth, not gossiped, not sensationalized, just plainly told, spread through that community the way real truth spreads, quietly, gradually, until certain women who had always greeted Vernetta warmly started greeting her carefully instead. Vernetta knew the difference. She had spent enough years building social capital to recognize when somebody was quietly making withdrawals from it. Simone sent a message through Nadine's assistant about 6 weeks after the announcement. Not quite an apology. More of an acknowledgement that she understood now that she had been given an incomplete picture, that she had accepted a story without asking enough questions about the person telling it. Nadine's assistant passed it along. Nadine never replied. That silence was its own complete sentence. It cost her nothing and said everything. About 2 months after the announcement, Nadine drove back to the property. Early morning. That Garfield Park block was quiet at that hour, the kind of quiet that belongs to people who get up before the world starts making noise. Construction had already begun. The old building that her father had held onto for 20 years was being transformed into something that was going to reshape that entire corridor. Jobs, investment, the kind of lasting change that Ernest Worthy had always believed the neighborhood deserved. She stood on the sidewalk in front of it and just looked. Brianna pulled up behind her 10 minutes later. Hadn't called to say she was coming. Just knew, the way she always knew, and she brought 2 cups of coffee and stood close enough that their arms were almost touching. That was the whole apology for telling Nadine to settle. Nadine accepted it completely. Because she understood that Brianna had said what she said from love and from fear for her friend, not from a belief that Nadine wasn't capable of more. She stood there thinking about her father, not about Devon. About Ernest Worthy and a kitchen table and documents spread out under a lamp and a man's patient voice telling her that the ground speaks to you if you're willing to listen. She thought about what it actually costs to wait, not patience as some soft virtue, but patience as a daily discipline, something you practice actively, something that requires you to absorb humiliation and loss and mockery and still keep your hand on the thing you're building. She thought about the repast, the parking lot, the midnight dragging, the floor of that apartment. The birthday party, the phone call with Brianna, every single moment in between where it would have been so human, so completely understandable, to break, to confront them, to perform her pain, to answer every lie with the truth, loudly, publicly, in a way that made it clear they had gotten to her. She was grateful she hadn't, not because staying quiet made her a saint, but because staying quiet had kept her strategy alive, and her strategy had built something real. And something real was the only answer that was ever going to be sufficient. Any confrontation, any public outburst, any moment where she let them see the wound would have been temporary, would have given them something to point at, would have made her a character in their story instead of the author of her own. The paperwork told the story she chose to tell. The paperwork didn't beg. It didn't explain itself. It just laid out what was true, cleanly and without apology. Some people see your silence and call it weakness. Let them call it whatever they want. Silence is just a strategy wearing patience as a coat. The woman who understands what she has built does not need to announce it. She just opens the folder when it's time. Nadine took a long sip of her coffee. Brianna said something about the way the morning light was catching the building, the new framing going up, the shape of what it was becoming already visible. Nadine looked at it. She said, "Yeah, it looks like what it is. A foundation, built correctly, built to outlast everything that had tried to speak louder than it. If this story moves something in you, if you have ever been underestimated by the exact people who were supposed to know you best, if you have ever had to sit in silence while somebody told a story about you that wasn't true, and you had to trust that the truth would show up eventually, then this story was for you. Comment below and tell me, have you ever had to stay quiet when everything in you wanted to answer? What kept you from breaking? Hit that like button if Nadine's story hit home. Share this with someone who is in the middle of building something right now, quietly, while people around them are talking. Let them know the paperwork is coming. Stay focused. And subscribe, because every single week we bring you stories like this. Stories about real people who got pushed all the way to the edge and found out that the edge was exactly where their foundation began. We tell these stories for the ones who stayed quiet and kept building. We'll see you in the next one.